Hey everyone, this is Abby Thurston. I teach 7th and 8th grade science, and today I'm going to be talking about how I implement laboratory investigations into my classroom. This is something I'm super passionate about. I try and do labs as much as possible, and in the past virtual seminars, you've probably heard me talk a little bit about how I integrate hands-on activities in my room, and so today I'm going to show you what that looks like in my room. Take everything that I'm going to share with a grain of salt, and I hope you walk away with some really fun ideas that you can do in your classroom. And I'm just going to share what works for me. Over the past 7 years, I've learned a whole lot from doing labs, and I know that labs can be super daunting to start with, especially when you're creating your own labs. That can be super overwhelming. So I just want to share some tips and tricks on how I do that. And so I have 4 things I'm going to share today. I'm going to give you starting points for success and how to implement successfully. I'm going to talk about how I create my own lab templates from scratch, and it's going to blow your mind because everyone I ever shared this with, it blows their mind. And then I'm going to share some tips for integrating these lab templates into your classroom. And then I'm going to share a couple of examples in what I do in my 7th grade class. So I know this sounds super crazy, but the starting point for successful labs is the scientific method. I know that this probably sounds silly solely because it's not necessarily specifically listed in our standards, but because I teach 8th grade science, I get a whole lot of kind of more information and a glance at what our students need to know to be successful as they hit high school courses. And one of the biggest things that we notice in high school from the practice milestones assessments is the need for analyzing laboratory investigations. And it almost always involves hypothesis and variables. And so when I do labs in my classroom, I start with understanding, I want my kids to understand how to create their very own hypothesis and then how to differentiate between the different variables. And so the goal for creating labs in my classroom is for students to walk away with like a recipe for success when analyzing labs. Another thing that I do in my classroom, aside from the scientific method, is I want them to understand the science and engineering practices. So some of my investigations in labs may look very laboratory investigation kind of. It will look like a step-by-step process for students to follow. And then some investigations that we do are solely design-based, where they're designing a product of some sort. And so the goal is for kids to be able to carry out their own investigations and design processes. And the best way to ensure that they understand what they're doing is by providing them with some background information on the science and engineering practices and the scientific method. I'm going to go back a slide for a second, and I just want to hit one more time on the scientific method. I feel like it can be super instrumental in incorporating this into your classroom. And literally, once your kids are trained on the scientific method, specifically hypothesis and creating variables, once they understand those 2 things, you're set up for success for the entire year. And if you can get your entire school on board with incorporating these steps into labs, then you're going to have students that as they hit, like if you introduce it in 6th grade and then you're re-hitting it in 7th, and then by 8th grade, they're going to be really good at using these steps and creating their own experiments. And so I'm just a huge advocate for this, and I think it's a great way to start off the year by incorporating these things. And so I'll even start the first week of school when I'm getting to know my kids. We'll do an investigation of some sort. Maybe it's super basic with which paper towel works the best. And I'm just using that to teach them these things so that they can be successful when we're incorporating standards into the learning. The other thing I wanted to talk about for starting for success is I want you to really understand that laboratory investigations don't have to be huge. They can be tiny little lessons within a lesson. Just getting kids' hands on things is a really great way to hit the standards when it's saying design and construct. I also feel that we can get our students to design investigations without even carrying out the investigation. I know not all schools have supplies at their hands that they can use for investigations, and so it can be super eye-opening just for kids to design an investigation. And maybe you carry it out for them. Maybe your class designs an entire experiment and you pick the best one, or maybe you pick 4 of similar designs and then you do it as a demo. So that can just be very crucial for kids and just understanding concepts. Their hands aren't actually on the products, but their brains are wrapping around how they could create a lab. And then I also think that a great starting point are ideas. So where do I find a lot of ideas from? I find a lot of ideas from Pinterest, which is so silly, I know, but it's a great place to just find, like I will literally type in Pinterest a word, maybe it's a topic that we're covering, and I'll see what just pops up. I also love glancing through science catalogs for ideas that I'll make my own spin on things. And so those are just 2 places that you can start when you're trying to figure out what lab to use when you're teaching genetics or when you're teaching cells. It's just a great place to start. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about my templates that I use. And this is probably the best thing that you're going to walk away with today. I have 2 ways in which I create templates for my students. The first way is through a digital Google Doc. I love using Google Docs when I'm doing labs because the kids can collaborate all at once through one Google Doc. And I'm going to talk more about that when I share the template that I use. The second way that I create templates is through the use of a folded sheet of paper. And I'm going to share that in a second. And then I'm also going to show you what a mini lesson kind of might look like. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about is, I'm going to talk about it right now. I love to get my students' attention when I'm doing labs by introducing a probe or a question. And I think it can be super awesome to have a question on maybe your screen up front, and then you have your students design an experiment based off of a question or a probe that you've given them. And so this is the paper folding template that I use. This is a great template when you're wanting to make an experiment happen quickly. So some experiments can take an entire class period. Maybe some experiments take 2 or 3 days. This is a great template for a 20, 30-minute lab. It's super flexible. The squares do not have to be what you see. So when I use a sheet of paper as a template, I will have a slide on my board in my classroom, and it's probably a picture or it's a question. And then my students will have to create a title about what they see on my board in my classroom. And then I have them fold their paper and to create 4 separate quadrants. And so the first quadrant is going to be their claim. And that is typically where my kids will put hypothesis and variables. You could even have them list the materials that they're going to use in that first box. The second box is going to be the procedure that they design. And so that would be like the steps that they follow. And when you first do this with your students, giving them freedom is like they're not going to know what to do with it. They're going to be stuck. They're going to be like, oh my gosh, what do I do? I don't know what she's looking for. Because a lot of times in science, teachers give recipes that they want their students to follow. And so trying to get our students trained for designing their own, this is a great way to kind of start that process. So first box is claim, second box is going to be their list of steps that they're creating. The third box, there's two things that I might be looking for. So data collection can be done in a table, or maybe it's going to be a table and a small graph, or maybe it's going to be so you can have quantitative data or qualitative data. It could be words, it could be pictures that they draw. It's whatever that they decide is going to illustrate their data. And then the last box is going to be their conclusion. And I always have them restate their claim and then give a piece of evidence from the data that is on the sheet of paper that they have created. And then an explanation or reasoning about the data that they have incorporated. The boxes on the sheet of paper that you see on my screen can change. You can make your boxes whatever you want them to be. Maybe you are way more focused on claim, procedure. Maybe you want them to incorporate for specifically a graph. It literally, there's tons of flexibility in this, but I have found that this really works when I'm allowing my students to design their own experiment. The goal of this template is for it to be student designed. I always have my kids do this in either pairs or groups. I find that that is the most efficient way to do this. And when I use this specific strategy, like paper folding, I will throw a timer on my board and I give them 20 minutes. And you would think it's crazy that I would give them 20 minutes, but they will do it in 20 minutes. If they know that there's a timer on the board, I promise you they will design an experiment in 20 minutes. And so now I wanted to show you an example of what that looks like. So here is a procedure that we did. And my students needed more space than the 4 squares. So instead of doing 4 squares, I had them fold their papers in half. And so on the front, I had them make predictions. The second box, I had them do procedures. On the back of this page, which you don't see, they had data collection and a graph, and then under the 4th square, they wrote a conclusion. And so this specific experiment, I gave them different vegetables and fruits, and I used this specific activity for teaching osmosis and diffusion. So I did this with my advanced students. You can totally do this with your grade level students if you're wanting to extend the learning for them. I think this is a great lab to do with them. And it's an also easy introduction lab for having them design their own experiment. I gave them a whole lot of freedom and let them pick the objects that they used. So if I were doing this in a grade level class, I would have them pick like one object to test. So instead of, like you see on my screen, that these students picked potatoes and carrots. Maybe if I were doing this with grade level, I would say you can only pick one. And then I also had solutions up front. So I had a sugar solution, a salt solution, a water solution, and then I had a food coloring solution for my advanced kids just to see what they would come up with for their predictions. And then they could pick between the solutions that they wanted to include. And then I had them record their procedures. And when they do this, it's really important that you remind them that when they're creating the procedures or steps, that anyone, like they should make it so that anyone can follow it. So somebody in language arts who has no idea what we're talking about could come into my class and create this experiment. And so this is just a great way to get them doing a hands-on activity, learning, and it was self-created. They're going to remember everything that this lab was about because they did it on their own. Second way that I use templates in my classroom is through Google Docs. And like I said, I love Google Docs because of collaboration. This is a template that I use whenever I'm designing a Google version of an investigation. And I have them, maybe sometimes I will have them create their own background information, or sometimes I'll give it to them. I'm going to show you several examples of this specific template. And this gives them a place to collaborate because multiple people can type on it at once. And then I also tell them what they're doing. So you see that I have made comments on the screen saying that Ms. Thurston must see your procedure before you carry out an investigation. So typically when I'm circling the room, I will go to each group or pair and I'll be like, okay, let me read the steps that you're doing and that you're going to follow. And if it looks like it's not correct, I'll give them some feedback. I also love Google Docs because they can share to receive feedback. Feedback can be super helpful in figuring out the problems in science. And so I love to have them share with 2 to 3 people and receive feedback. And when they do that, I'm looking for specific feedback. And I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. So let me show you an example of what this looks like because I know it's very vague on the screen. So here is an example that I made up. And I use this when I introduce our ecology unit. I also use this when I'm introducing the different types of variables. And so what you see is a preferred environment challenge. And I have found that when you title things a challenge, it gets your kids immediately engaged because they're excited about a challenge. And in this particular template, I gave them some background information. So I used blackworms because we could get them and they were cheap. Blackworms also reproduce very fast. And so that's another reason why I use them because I could get a lot of them. And so their goal was to design an experiment and figure out which ecosystem or preferred environment the blackworms preferred. At my school, we have these things called choice chambers where you place organisms in the center and they pick which side to go to. But if you don't have choice chambers, you can get super creative with this. Like you could use a plate and half of the plate is going to have one environment on it and the other half is going to have another environment. I know that when we're doing experiments, supplies are really hard to find. And so being super creative with supplies is really crucial in allowing your kids the freedom of creating their own experiments. And I'm going to talk more about that in a second. I also love when I do self-designed labs for my students. I love to give them creativity. So I'll give them a couple of supplies and then I typically have a cart in the front of my room with any and everything. And it always has one thing that one group needs that is not on the cart. Because when you give them creativity, they really start thinking outside the box. And so I'll either be like, okay, tomorrow when we do this lab, you bring in that supply. And I'm going to talk more about what the timeline for this lab looks like in the classroom in a minute. I just wanted to share an example of how I use this in a classroom and what this looks like. So complete freedom is really huge when you want your kids to understand procedures. I know that it can be hard to give your kids complete freedom. And so now I'm going to talk about how I manage complete freedom and how I make it work. And so the first way to do this is I try very hard when I do labs to do them in pairs or groups. And I try really hard to ability group my students. I sometimes will let them pick, and then sometimes I'll assign who their group members are. And this is a contract that I use at the beginning of the year, or whenever I give them new groups, I'll have them refill out this contract. Sometimes we do it for every project that we use, but I've just found that this specifically works really well at holding kids accountable in their group. And so feel free to steal it if you want. You can screenshot it. I just found that it works well in getting all kids engaged and holding them accountable. Yeah. Okay. These are some tips that I use when managing a class of 30 to 40 kids at a time doing a lab. This year, it looks a little bit differently. I am in person and I have my biggest class is with 29 students in person. And so we're having to make it work. I do have students in pairs this year. I have to have them in pairs because of the seating in my classroom, but you make what works best for you depending upon what your district wants you doing. These are tips that you could use this year, next year, years to come. I just want to share some management pieces when doing labs. So I use these tricks when I'm doing student-led investigations. I also use these tricks when I'm doing guided investigations. So maybe they're not creating the investigation, instead they're following my list of steps. So the first thing I ever tried in my classroom was a red Solo cup. I don't have green ones. I can't find them. If y'all find them somewhere, you just send me a link because I would love some green Solo cups. But I will use red Solo cups, and I love them because they make an echo. So when I'm doing a lab, in order to make sure that kids are on task and doing things correctly, I will have red Solo cups to the front of my room. And before I start the lesson, I will be like, okay, guys, red Solo cups. If a red Solo cup ends up on your table, that means something's wrong. So it could be that they're not following directions. It could be that they're out of their seat. It could be that they're noisy. And so I will place a red Solo cup right side up, like you're going to drink out of it. And that's like their warning. And then they all know that this is the warning. And when you see the red Solo cups go out, I mean, the whole class, they start to focus because they know that if that red Solo cup gets turned over, that group is like, they're basically done for the day. They don't get to continue the lab. And I'll have like a backup assignment for them. The reason I love the Solo cup is because it echoes. When you flip it over, it makes a loud sound and the whole class sees it. I will tell you, I only have to bring the red Solo cups and use this example once. And when you make that example of a group, like for the rest of the year, the kids will remember that and they will do the experiments correctly. I've also used red, green, and yellow sheets of paper. Green means go, yellow means warning, red means you're done. And so that's really good for kids who you don't want to embarrass. I've used both and they both work really well. And then the other thing, I have black lab desks. And so I had a really hard time trying to figure out how I could write on kids' desks because sometimes individual students need help with staying on task and keeping their behavior. And so I will literally 3 strikes you're out, and I will mark tallies on the desk for the kid so that it's a visual prompt for them. And that's really helpful in keeping them on task. The other thing that I have found that helps when doing laboratory investigations is giving every kid a job. So these 4 bullets, timekeeper, materials manager, data collector, team leader, are the 4 bullets that work best in my classroom. When I'm doing this in a group of 4 or groups of 3 in a non-COVID year, I would do groups of 4 and every kid would have a different job. This year we're doing everything's in pairs. So this year I have kids picking 2 jobs instead of just doing 1, they'll have 2. This is just super helpful in making sure that every person has a role in the experiment. It just works really well. I also try really hard to ability group. And so I will do like 2 students or 1 student that's a high learner, and I'll group them with a middle learner, or maybe I'll do high-low or middle-low. And that's just helpful in general when doing experiments because sometimes kids need help from their peers. I sometimes can't explain it in a way that a peer can. And so that is why I tend to group them like this. And it just works best. I've found that assigning groups works a whole lot better than letting students pick their partners. Okay, I use timers for everything. I use Google Slides. Y'all may use PowerPoints. I don't know what you use, but I have a TV in my classroom and I don't have a projector. And so on my TV, I literally Google timers depending upon how much time I want, and you can find this specific timer anywhere, and it's super helpful. I also try to make sure I have enough supplies to do things in groups or pairs, and that means getting super creative, especially this year because I don't have enough supplies to do things in pairs. And so we as a grade level will stagger the days in which we do things. And I am really lucky to work with a group of teachers who are willing to stagger days in which we do experiments and we combine our supplies. I also use baskets for everything, and I have found a lot of people so these baskets come from Dollar Tree. You may find them on Amazon during the summertime. Target Dollar Spot has great baskets, but I use baskets for creating labs. I put any supply that they are going to need in the bucket, and it just helps keep things super organized. And then at the start of every lab, y'all, this is genius. I threatened my class one time and was like, if y'all don't leave this thing, my lab set up like you found it, we're going to have issues. Well, one of my kids whipped out their cell phone. I was like, what are you doing on your cell phone? And the kid goes, oh, I'm just taking a picture of the bin so I remember what it looks like. I literally do this for every lab now, and it is so helpful in keeping a clean room and keeping lab buckets clean and organized. So I use buckets for everything, and I get super creative with materials. I don't have a ton of beakers, so we will use cups. I will ask my kids to bring in things if I don't have them. We use the outdoors a whole lot to find supplies. We even sometimes go scrounging the recycling bins. So get creative with what you're using. I love to keep students in their seats when we're doing laboratory investigations, and so these are just 2 tips that I wanted to share because they work for me. Whenever we do a lab, we'll have a trash cup. I hate lab days when kids are up out of their seats. It is when kids are out of their seats during a lab day, things happen like mess up, and it's not on purpose, but kids make mistakes. Maybe they bump into someone, or maybe they knock something over. And so the more you can keep your kids in your seat, the better. And so what greater way to do this than providing every kid with a trash cup? Sometimes it's a cup, sometimes it's a bucket, sometimes it's a box. I also have learned over the years that water gets spilled very easily. And so you see a picture of, it says waste on it because it was a lab we were doing. But instead of having kids get up 24 times to go fill up their cup with water in the one sink that I have in my classroom, I provide water, and I use the X-ray markers that I was talking about earlier to draw a circle, and that cup has to stay in that circle if it's not in your hand. That's super helpful in making sure that messes don't happen, and every kid knows where the cup is. And then in a COVID year, I have found that having a clean bucket and a used bucket is super helpful for labs. So I've just gotten really creative. This year's been hard for me because I thrive in a hands-on classroom. And so I clean everything. I have a spray bottle with cleaner in it, and we wipe it down. And these are the things that are working for me this year so that I can continue doing labs. Okay, last 2 things I want to share about tips for integration. I love checklists. So maybe you're providing students with a list of steps to follow. And so when I did checklists in the past, I would print off a checklist for each individual bucket, and the kids could mark on it. Well, I found that I was wasting a whole lot of paper. And so I decided, you know what, why not put them in clear pocket protectors? So I literally have an entire basket full of sheet pocket protectors that you can put in your notebook. And I will put the checklist in those pocket protectors. And in every bin, whenever I do a lab, I will include a checklist with an expo marker. And as students are completing the lab, they check off that they're following each step. And this is awesome because when you see that a lab isn't going right, the first thing that comes out of my mouth is, are you checking off your steps? And 9 times out of 10, they're not when they mess up. And so that's super helpful in managing labs with kids doing it on their own. And then earlier I talked about feedback. I love to have my students share their Google Docs and receive feedback from others. And I really focus on being kind with your words. The feedback has to be helpful. Don't just tell me it was good. what about it was good? Or if it's bad, tell me like a helpful piece of advice about how I can make it better. And then I try to also make sure my students are using very specific feedback. So instead of saying your lab, the whole lab was bad, I want to know like what specifically needs help being fixed. And so specifically step 3 of your lab report was wrong. And so that is super helpful, and it's not in a derogatory, mean language. Okay, my biggest piece of advice when you're doing labs is to take your time. And I know that can be difficult when you're trying to fit in a lot of stuff. But over the years, I have learned that a lab does not have to happen in one day, especially when you're doing big labs. I love to introduce the lab halfway through a class period and tell my kids that tomorrow in class, this is what you're going to be creating your own lab. You're going to be carrying out a lab. And that gives them time to A, think about what they're doing, and B, create. Like when you're being creative, you need time to come up with ideas. It's also a great way for them to bring in supplies. So when I use the creation templates, specifically like a Google Doc, we'll spend an entire day creating an investigation. They are not going to test in that class period. If they finish early with their designing, I have them share to receive feedback. And if they finish that early, I'll have an alternative assignment for them to work on. And then the second day will be like carrying out the lab. I promise it's worth the time. You just have to try. Like, I promise it's worth it. You will be blown away. Yeah, it's just so worth the time. So I wanted you to walk away with some examples. So I would say I create probably 50% of the labs I do in my room. And what that means is like I try to find some way for my kids to design the labs, especially in 7th grade. I'm trying to train them for 8th grade because in 8th grade, I would say close to 80% of the labs are self-created labs that kids are doing. And so by incorporating as much as I can in 7th grade, I'm preparing them to be super successful in 8th grade. Here is an example of another Google Doc that I created. This one is super easy too. I'll read it out loud. It says, Mr. Eddie's trying to grow a garden at his home. He wants plants to grow fast and be healthy. It's your job to design an experiment to help him reach his goals. So in this specific activity, we're just testing. They could test anything. They could test the environment. They could test what they're feeding their plant. Maybe they're testing light. I give them freedom with this one, and you will have multiple students create different labs. In this specific experiment, I don't have tons of pots for them to plant plants, and so we actually use cut up water bottles. And so that's just a creative way. You could even use bags. Whatever works for you, use. And then I always, before my students start their procedure, try to include a spot for me to like do my teacher sign off. When it's digital, I'm obviously not going to be writing on their Chromebook that I've signed off, but I will type in my initials or my name. If I'm in a hurry, I'll be like, looks good, please type my name. And that's like their signature. Some other ideas for investigations earlier, I talked about blackworms. You could totally use earthworms. I've seen isopods used. I've actually done them with isopods before. And I have an example with isopods I'll show you in a second. Another great example, I talked about the carrots earlier, but you could use grapes for teaching osmosis. For genetics, you could use seeds. I love using onions when we use microscopes, so that's really cool. And then a way to incorporate engineering standards will be designing something. And so when we cover the excretory system, we have our students design kidneys, and that's super cool. And I literally give them complete freedom of that. Their goal is for their kidney to filter out to be clear water. Okay, I think I might have 2 more examples. But here's another example. This example is more teacher-led, but still giving them freedom to pick their hypothesis. This is an epidemics lab that I do, and I walk them through the majority of this lab. And however, because I'm walking them through it, I try to have them come up with their own background information. So this lab specifically I do in the middle of the unit, and I just wanted to show you an example of how students can design a lab with the teacher still guiding the learning. I will allow them to design parts of it, and as a class, we'll come up with a hypothesis, or maybe half the room tests one hypothesis and the other half tests a different hypothesis. That's just an idea of how you can do it. And then what you don't see is a checklist, and so I typically have checklists when I have teacher-led experiments, and this is just an example of a teacher-led experiment. And then here is the actual isopod lab that I did. I think I did this a year ago, but that is what a choice chamber looks like on the screen. And this was a student example. So my students designed this lab using isopods, and I just wanted to show you what your kids will come up with if you give them the opportunity to experiment. I will say that this lab took me 3 days to complete. I used this specific lab to introduce variables, and so that was part of it. Then designing their own lab, and then they received more than 3 pieces of feedback from other students, and that is why it's such a specific lab. And I couldn't fit the conclusion on the screen, but there was an awesome conclusion written. So I know I just shared a lot of ideas. I hope you walked away with something. I hope that you found the templates to be super helpful. I'm telling you, just give your kids the opportunity to try it, and what they come up with will be super awesome. I hope that this sparks some ideas, and I hope you remember that even though it's a COVID year, we can still do investigations. We just have to try. So if you need anything, holler at me. If you have questions or you want me to share templates with you, I'm happy to do that. And if you have a template that you use, I'd love to see it. So please feel free to email. But that's all I've got for today. I hope y'all have a great week.